The only
Revelation Television is committed to making a wide range of Christian television programs, from studies to documentaries, from debates to music programs, from testimonies to talk shows. All are made possible because of viewer support for Revelation Foundation. Thank you for making it possible.
Hi and welcome to The Point. My name is Birgit Whelan and it's really great to be back with you for another program this evening. Well, some of you may have been with us recently on the program where we discussed the topic of anger. And as part of that program, we touched on the point about when anger escalates into forms of abuse. And we mentioned that that would be a really interesting topic to come back to. So that's what we're discussing tonight, in particular verbal and emotional abuse. And what we can do if we find ourselves in this kind of situation. Can we look to Scripture for any hope or any insights about how to handle this? And we're just wanting to consider this from all angles on the program. So joining me to discuss this is the Centre Director for LL Ministries Pierpont, Jill Southern-Jones. Jill, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Well, this is such an important topic, and just before the program we were talking about how there are possibly many people whose lives are affected by this, either within their marriage or family relationships, possibly even in other settings like church or work. So it's really helpful that we're able to consider this. And I just wonder if we could start off with a definition about what constitutes verbal and emotional abuse.
Yes, I think it's an abuse of power. Mm-hmm. It's abusing, in these cases, the relationship and controlling the other person. Abuse is really about overriding the other person's freedom to choose and removing that in order to gain something for oneself. So you could talk about the abuser and the victim. And the victim comes underneath the power, the anger, the control of the other person, and has to do what they want without any discussion together about what they want to do together in that friendship.
So it's just basically a complete form of domination of one over another. And in the context of verbal abuse, what kind of form does that take?
Well, verbal abuse can start in the playground where people call names. And so somebody who's got ginger hair or wears glasses, they can pick on some attribute or characteristic and name call. And it can be insulting and it can be hurtful. And as children, we're not really sure quite what to do with it. As we grow into adults, then of course it can start when friendships turn sour, where there's conflict in relationships. Then verbal abuse can be insults. A parent to a child can say, well, you were a mistake, we never planned to have you, you're useless, you're a waste of space, so on. And so the person all the time is condemned and put down. I suppose false accusation is another one. It can be very abusive to be continually accused for usually something which is in the abuser, that they then complain to the other person, either in the family or a friendship, that you act like this, you lie, you don't tell the truth, or whatever. And actually, it's not the victim, but in fact the person who's abusing them that is like that. So it's a sort of blame shifting issue.
So at the moment, it's interesting to consider those examples. There are insults, put-downs, blame-shifting, accusations, criticism. Would that be another?
Terrible criticism, whereby you can never do it right. So it could again be your mother, you're supposed to be doing a job, and she'll continually pick on it, and you try it harder and harder and harder to get it absolutely right, but of course the day never comes. And you're just totally put down and criticised and rejected and made to feel terrible all the time. So to live in an environment with a critical person can be absolutely horrible. And the person ends up feeling it's all my fault.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, the effect that it actually has on the victim of this kind of behaviour. I mean, you've mentioned different sort of age groups as well, and it would be interesting to consider that. Firstly, with children in the playground, because there may be parents who are watching whose children are suffering bullying at the moment. And as you're saying, it's very difficult for a child to process that when it's happening or know how to respond. If a parent is aware that their child is actually facing this kind of abuse in the playground, do you have any advice that you might be able to offer with what they could do to help their child?
Yes, it's always important to stand up to a bully. If we back off from a bully, they advance, and we back off even more. We end up in quite an intolerable position. So we have to encourage our children to either not to take it in and shrug their shoulders and move on, but not allow very important, we don't allow the abuser to know that they've hurt us, or we're frightened of them, or we're backing off from them. So trying to encourage our kids to stand up to verbal bullies or emotional bullies. But actually, it should, if it becomes, if it's really become something that's regular, then they do need to tell the people at the school, the teachers and those in charge about what's happening.
What about for people who are watching who, when they were children, they were either abused by or bullied by their peers, or they faced criticism and the kind of verbal abuse you've described by their parents or other caregivers, and so they were wounded as children and they've basically taken that into adulthood and been affected by that. For someone in that situation, what would you say to them to offer hope?
Yes, I think that this then becomes quite deep, painful wounding, but the person's own value of themselves drops.
Yes.
So they think, actually, I'm not a good person, and actually I am a waste of space, and I'm a failure, and I'll never amount to anything, or whatever the insults have been levied against them. They can very easily take that on in their own belief system. And of course then we feel very bad about ourselves, we can feel depressed, people can even feel suicidal. So it really does need addressing, and it's a terrible thing to have this ongoing torture of verbal abuse. And trying to live with it and not knowing how to cope with it.
Yeah, because what you're saying is that it's actually, it affects a person's identity and their understanding of themselves, their value before God. And actually, as you're speaking about that, I wonder whether then it can affect somebody in terms of who they choose to enter a marriage relationship with. Have you seen that happen?
Yes, I think that the sad thing about this is when we live in an environment which is insult-based, and the person is always the victim. Interestingly, when they choose a married partner, they can choose somebody who has the same character traits that they also... we could take something like shouting.
Right.
Shouting is verbal abuse. I mean, I personally hate being shouted at.
Yes.
And would very much strongly avoid shouting at any person, because I think that can be very traumatic. Shouting, we looked at anger, didn't we?
We did,
Shouting, of course, can overspill into anger. People say things when they're angry, they lose control, that they probably don't really mean. But the victim takes totally into their heart, and it's like the fiery darts of the wicked have penetrated all your defence systems, and you are deeply wounded and traumatised. So the new spouse can actually be very similar sometimes. You think the last person they'd ever want to get married to is somebody who's got the same problems and issues, but they go, because somehow this is what they know.
Right.
When they come out of that in their own family home, they marry somebody who actually abuses them in a similar way and controls them, of course. It's all about control and domination and manipulation of the abuser towards the victim.
So can we just talk about that now? Because I wonder whether there are people watching who are in marriages, and maybe they've been in a marriage for a long period of time, where this kind of behaviour goes on as a matter of course. So the insults, the put-downs, the criticism, even the shouting that you're talking about, and they've just basically learnt to live, or a couple coexists in this sort of situation. Can you describe what happens to a person over a long period of time if, in a marriage relationship, if they live with this? What happens to them?
Well, it can start with, say, let's look at it from a woman's point of view. A controlling husband can start saying, "I don't like you wearing that. Do you know you look awful in that, and that necklace, that looks really cheap and nasty, and to go and take that off, or I don't like your hair like that. I want you don't want you to do it, to have it like that." So, for a woman, always to have her appearance, her hair, what she's wearing, constantly criticised and put down and disliked, can be hugely traumatic. Mm-hmm. And to live with that, I mean, really, we could say from a Christian aspect, no Christian wife should have to put up with that. So we either reach out for outside help. Very often, of course, the controller doesn't want to know about outside help. But if it gets unbearable, the person does have a choice. Do I stay in this situation which looks like it's got no remedy, or do I actually say, I'm not going to, God isn't asking me to submit to this which is terribly ungodly, and it's reducing me, the person that I am, and it's giving me this very victim mentality, and actually they don't have to put up with it.
Well, it's a really interesting point, and I was hoping to ask you this, and I think that a lot of people do question this in a Christian context, because we know that scripturally there are clear guidelines with regard to separation and divorce, and so these areas of abuse, both physical, that's one area, but also this area of verbal and emotional abuse. The question comes up, does the Bible offer grounds for separation, divorce, in this sort of situation? So can I ask you that? I mean, you've already kind of described a bit about that.
Yes, in Corinthians, Paul writes and talks about that you can separate. Now, we need to make a differentiation between separation and divorce. A married couple can separate, which just means they don't live together anymore. They separate. They have their own lives, but that doesn't allow for remarriage. So, really, with emotional abuse, I would be encouraging the person to try and see, first of all, is there a remedy? Will the person join me in seeking help? Appropriate help for the issues we're in, because there's a lot of marriages like this. If one part, it takes two to tango. If one person is not in the least interested, usually the abuser is not in the least interested about seeking help, then I think the person needs to go to their pastor or leader and talk it through, because just talking it out may be very helpful, and try to get some prayer cover from fellow Christians about the situation, and seek another person's help in what do I do with this. I don't believe that God requires us to live permanently in an abusive relationship. So I would encourage the person, probably if they're really at the end of their tether, to separate. We see this example with Sarah and Hagar. Here is Abraham, poor man, And his wife says, well, you better go in, obviously this baby that we're promised never going to happen. You better go into Hagar, my servant girl, and have a child through her, which he does. Now, that was Sarah's suggestion.
Yes.
But it doesn't work. Because Hagar is on Sarah's case all the time. I'm the one with the son, you haven't got a son. I'm the one that's got Abraham's boy. I'm the one that's blessed by God. And it probably went on and on and on and on until we read in the scripture that Sarah could handle it no longer and really gives Abraham an ultimatum. It's either her or me, for this cannot continue. I'm at the end of my tether. And we know the story that Abraham then takes Hagar and Ishmael off into the desert and exit from Sarah's life Hagar. But this is an example where it really didn't, it was really the verbal abuse or the manipulation or the continual conflict that she was living through. She couldn't go on. She couldn't cope with it any longer.
It's really interesting that you can point to this biblical example because it does convey this idea that where there is this ongoing abusiveness or harassment, that actually a boundary can be put in place, and it does obviously change the circumstances. It's really helpful getting your feedback on that question about separation and divorce in light of an ongoing abusive situation, verbal, emotional abusive situation. I know that having done programs before on divorce, remarriage, that there are a lot of different viewpoints that or theological views that people hold. So it's important to mention that, but it is really helpful to get your understanding on that and basically your suggestion of what people can do if they find themselves in this situation. Maybe no one else knows about it. Maybe they're quietly desperate. Maybe they have this view that they need to hold on no matter what, because we know that of God's heart towards marriage and covenant. So it's just helpful to hear your suggestion about how people can reach out to pastors, to counsellors, to other support people.
They need outside help for this. Preferably the both of them go, but if that's not going to work, then at least the victim should go and seek appropriate help for themselves.
Right.
And of course it can't be a quick decision, and you can always be praying for some sort of reconciliation. Maybe the separation itself brings the person to their senses, Divorce is a different issue. I think, Jesus says in Matthew 5, for the case of marital unfaithfulness. Now, people have always read that across to adultery. I do think it's more than adultery, sexual adultery.
Yeah.
I think that if somebody is really being badly abused, that it does break the marriage covenant. And, I think that there's so many different views on this subject, but I think you have to look at what equals marital unfaithfulness, when the scripture does say very strongly a husband should love his wife more than he loves himself. And actually, in the same way as Christ loved the church, and of course Jesus died for the church. So I always say in the men's meetings, if you're on the Titanic, men, and there's only one seat in the lifeboat, it's not yours.
Right. Yeah.
Because you're going to because you're going to love your wife more than you love yourself.
Yes.
So I do think that constant, terrible verbal or emotional abuse actually probably does equal marital unfaithfulness. I mean, I would certainly say to the person, try the separation first to see whether that puts pressure on them to seek proper help and get a reconciliation. However, they need to go, the woman herself or whoever it is needs to go to their spiritual leaders and ask for their spiritual advice and counsel.
Yes, I mean, it's just so interesting hearing your thoughts on this, and I know that if people are watching, that your details will come up on the screen in case people would like to follow up with LL Ministries. If they find themselves in this situation, they'd like to ask more questions, they're able to follow up with LL. And also, again, to reiterate, I know that this creates a whole people just have very different views on this whole topic about divorce and remarriage, so it is important to mention that. But it's so helpful what you're saying about what constitutes a breaking of the marriage covenant in this area of divorce. Of abuse. Yeah. So can I ask you then, what is it that actually creates the tendency to abuse in a person? What is it? What are the roots in a person that leads them to be abusive?
Yes, I think very often, if we were praying today with an abuser, probably the first question we're going to ask is, who abused you? And it's remarkable how many times somebody who's received specific abuse, whether it's verbal or sexual or emotional abuse, they were the victim and they become the abuser. And exactly what happened to them, they work out, they manifest in their own lives. So one of the routes we would look at is, have they been abused in the past and they've been wounded and hurt by that and haven't actually dealt with it?
Yes.
And I suppose one of the things we come back to is forgiveness. This is such a difficult issue for many people, but if we've been abused, one of the healing ways out of the effect of that abuse is to forgive the abuser. Now, I know that is a process and so forth, but if we end up not forgiving, we become bitter. And, you know, the scripture, it says, let no bitter root grow up in you, regardless of what's happened to us.
Yes.
And, of course, if the bitterness grows, then we've got the offence. And it's amazing how the person who's been abused in their past then becomes the abuser. So forgiveness is a very big healing issue for an abused person.
To basically break that pattern is what you're saying.
Otherwise it goes round in this cycle.
Yes.
I think John Bevere, I don't know whether you know his book on the bait of Satan.
Yes.
But he talks about, you know, if we're offended and we don't deal with the offence, we don't forgive the person, then we will go on to condemn the person, to despise the person, and finally to betray the person.
Right.
And then it's very easy for us to end up from being the abused to being the abuser. So the person that is emotionally abusing their wife or their friend or in the relationship, I would say has very often been emotionally abused themselves, and now they are the controller.
Right.
And is there something very deeply broken in their own identity of who they are or who they feel they are? So there's a core identity disorder in an emotional abuser, and they're using the power of their emotions in a wrong way to control another person in a relationship, because they only feel safe when they are in control.
Right.
And so this behaviour comes out of wounding, but of course it's sinful behaviour that's coming out of wounding.
It's so interesting, Jill, just actually considering this from both sides. So we've considered what the experience is like for the victim and how ongoing abuse can really deeply affect the identity of someone in that situation. But also on the other side, the abuser, and actually what, in your experience, you've often seen happening in the life of that person for them to become an abuser themselves. And again, it's an issue of identity, there being a brokenness there and a need of healing actually on both sides. So it may be that there are people watching who can actually recognise in themselves a tendency to be abusive in the ways that you've described towards their spouse or another family member or someone else. So once again, for people who either can see this in themselves or who are victims of this, your ministry details have come up so people have a way of reaching